Throughout history, and in every important modern society, there have been dynamic periods of change in which the ideals and perceptions of those who comprise the society have altered significantly. It is a characteristic that is primarily associated with European nations having experienced both the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, which both drastically altered European thought and actions at a time in which they occurred. However, for as common of an occurrence as it had become in Europe, this type of period had, before the 1900s, yet to bestow its definite embrace upon the United States. The year 1900 established not only the beginning of a new century, but the beginning of an era of revolutionary thought and radical change within the United States.
With the word progressivism, we outline a body of social thought, not all of it entirely coherent, that has to do with dealing with the process of industrialization in the United States. It isn't quite socialism, but it isn't laissez-faire capitalism on the other hand. It stands somewhere between those two things. So the progressive movement is a wholly political idea that tries to wed together certain factions behind various policies that are lumped together under progressivism.
This progressive era signified a new period of tolerance, which gave birth to several influential movements and literature articulating critical commentary on the political and social landscape. During this time of progression, there was no work more significant than The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, whose observations on the meatpacking industry and the state of the American dream ignited a turning point in America and contributed to the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, and eventually to the establishment of the US FDA. By the 1900s, American society had transitioned into a vastly different nation from the previous century. Industrialism had permeated throughout the country, resulting in a shift from an agrarian society to an urban society. Large corporations and trusts developed into prevalent economic forces. European immigrants of varying descents flocked rapidly to expanding industrial centers where they lived in overcrowded tenement slums and tirelessly competed for low wages. As the standard of life decreased, the corruption increased. Party bosses manipulated the political ignorance and desperation of these immigrants to further their own party machines.
Life was not very nice for a large number of Americans, especially when we compare it to the ideal of a sort of egalitarian republic that we have in our minds. A lot of small-time family farmers went out of business, and people went off the farms and looked for new jobs in cities where they would get jobs as unskilled laborers in factories or on docks. There was a great deal of cyclical unemployment, and a lot of people could expect to be out of work for about 3 months of the year. And this is going on at the same time as, of course, Carnegie, Rockefeller, the great titans of industry are accumulating enormous fortunes.
From this disarray emerged the contemporary American of the new era, idealists who sought to reform the lambasted democratic process.
It's also a time of broader, slow, long-term shifts in society and economy that show Americans trying to figure out how to be an industrial society and a just society at the same time.
Thus, the Age of Reform or Progressive Era was born. These social activists and reformers embarked upon crusades ranging from reform in local government, to public education, to medicine, to finance, to insurance, to industry, and to railroads. Women's rights came to the forefront of the American conscience at this time. However, the majority of the success that resulted from the Progressive Era was due to the muckrackers, investigative journalists who exposed political and economic corruption and social hardships caused by the power of big business in the rapidly industrializing United States.
You have the outgrowth of the old populist party and its underlying political movement to rein in monopolies and trusts. You have the social gospel movement, urban progressivism, focusing on the peculiar new problems of industrialism and urbanization and immigration and its implications for social cohesion, for social order. You have the sort of outgrowth of the mugwump movement, this focus on building a new American state, as Stephen Skowronek has said, to bring enlightened expertise to bear on the problems of an unregulated economy.
There is no muckracker in this time more prominent than Upton Sinclair. Sinclair was born in Baltimore, Maryland to Upton Beale Sinclair Sr. and Priscilla Hardin. His father was a liquor salesman who suffered from alcoholism and left Sinclair when he was a child. Although Sinclair's mother descended from a wealthy lineage, as Sinclair's maternal grandparents were wealthy, his family lived in extreme poverty. However, being that his grandparents lived so close to the family, Sinclair often crossed the boundary between the worlds of poverty and wealth, which gave him significant insight into how the rich and poor lived their lives in the late 19th century. Living in these two worlds affected Sinclair's perceptions and his works, especially his motivations for the jungle. Sinclair also claimed that it was among the reasons he became a socialist. Over his career, Sinclair wrote roughly 100 novels in which he documented and criticized the social and economic conditions of the early 20th century in both fiction and nonfiction. His examination of the injustices of capitalism and the overwhelming impact of poverty in his novels articulated the common ideals of the muckrakers, and thus the Progressive Era. The muckrakers rose to prominence after Sinclair's greatest and most influential novel was published in 1906, The Jungle. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poison rat was but a tidbit. There were the butt ends of smoked meat and the scraps of corned beef, and all the odds of the waste of the plants that would be dumped into the old barrels in the cellar and left there. Under the system of rigid economy, which the packers enforced, there were some jobs that only paid to do once in a long time, and among these was cleaning out the waste of the barrels. Every spring they did it, and in the barrels would be dirt and rust and stale water, and cartload after cartload of it would be taken up and dumped into the hoppers with fresh meat and sent out into the public's breakfast.
This quotation, and many more from the novel like it, set the tone for sweeping change within the United States.
By 1904, Chicago was the center of the meatpacking industry, an industry responsible for the slaughtering, processing, packaging, and distribution of animals for human consumption. And like many other industries at this time, it was wrought with corruption and greed. The workers faced horrid working conditions. In a time of progression, it was not progressing. Sinclair, looking to expose these truths, spent several weeks undercover in Chicago's meatpacking industries, and investigated the industry another 6 months afterwards, which served as his basis for the muckraking expose, The Jungle. In Sinclair's words, the novel's purpose was to set forth the breaking of human hearts by a system which exploits the labor of men and women for profit. The novel vividly depicts poverty, appalling living and working conditions, and the despair widespread among the working class. After its publication in 1906, Americans were deeply disturbed by the description of the unsanitary, revolting conditions in which the products citizens were eating were being produced, despite this not being the intention of Sinclair, such as accounts of workers falling into rendering takes and being ground, along with animal parts, into lard. As Sinclair later remarked, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." The Jungle was so profound that it influenced public to pressure the government into regulating the industry.
If I ask my students or people on the street, name to me the provisions of the First Amendment to the Constitution, they might talk about freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. The ones who are really sharp will remember the right to assemble peaceably. Nobody remembers, the right to petition your government. It's your government, and what it does is affecting your life. And so you need the ability as a citizen to try to affect what your government does to you or for you.
We have a representative political system, we have members of Congress, we have presidents, and they respond to the demands that are placed on them. If demands aren't made, they aren't likely to meet those demands. That's a basic truth of the American system.
After government investigators confirmed the book's facts, President Roosevelt threw his weight behind legislation to regulate the industry. 4 months after The Jungle was published, Congress passed the Meat Inspection Act, which established sanitary standards, and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required accurate labeling of food and empowered federal inspectors to prosecute corrupt plant owners, and set up the Bureau of Chemistry, later to become the FDA. Although they were not perfect laws, they symbolized the beginning of a safer meat industry, and today the FDA is one of the largest government organizations in the world.
The FDA regulates 25 cents out of every dollar every American spends. 25% of the economy is related to what is regulated and overseen by what the FDA does.
To this day, The Jungle will be remembered as the turning point in an industry that was going backwards in a time of progression. Without it, you might want to think twice before eating that steak.